The kitchen alarm clock rang exactly at 7 a.m. Like every other day, Vincent Hale left his bedroom, walked down the long hallway, turned on the kettle, and waited for the water to boil in absolute silence. No radio, no TV, no voices, not even a heavy breath. On the wall across from the dining table hung a large picture frame with a new glass pane, but inside was nothing but white. The old frame once held a photo of Vincent's wife and daughter, but that picture had been shattered on a rainy night 10 years ago. No one ever asked about it again, and Vincent never replaced it. Only one thing had remained unchanged. He no longer smiled. 10 years. Not once did his lips lift. Not once did the corners of his mouth soften. Not a single quiet laugh had escaped his chest. For 10 years his face seemed carved from cold stone, not because he was trying to look serious, but because he had truly forgotten what it felt like to laugh. People once called Vincent Hale the golden mind of the interactive tech industry. At 33, he had founded a virtual media platform that shattered every limit on how people could connect emotionally through the digital world. Financial magazines chased after him. Prestigious universities invited him to lecture. But after the accident, he sold all his shares and vanished from the industry. No news outlet ever found out where he went. Only a few old friends, very few, received a short email. "I'm still alive, but there's no need to keep in touch." The house he lives in now sits in the suburbs between two states. Not a luxurious mansion, but spacious and secluded, nestled beside a small forest. Perfect for a man who no longer wishes to interact with the world. A place where he could spend the rest of his life without ever hearing his name called again. In Vincent's kitchen drawer, everything was arranged with meticulous precision. Knives and forks separated by size, matching cups and plates, spices labeled and aligned. No dust, no clutter. But also, not a single object that hinted at someone who was truly living. The only person who had helped Vincent maintain that silent order was Sam, a middle-aged house assistant who had worked for him for nearly 5 years. Sam didn't talk much, always arrived on time, worked like clockwork, and left without a trace. But last week, Sam sent a simple message. "My sister's been hospitalized. I need to go take care of her long term. I hope you find a replacement soon." Vincent read it, nodded, and said nothing. He didn't reply. He didn't try to stop him. He opened his laptop and typed into a household service platform. Request, live-in housekeeper for 3 weeks. No need for conversation. No pets. No children. No music. No perfume. Prefer someone quiet. Send. Close laptop. Expect nothing. Because truthfully, he'd long grown used to expecting nothing from anyone. That day, Vincent stepped out onto the porch with a cup of black coffee. Sunlight filtered through the trees, lighting up the backyard, the place where his daughter once played. The little swing had long since rotted, but Vincent still hadn't taken it down. Maybe somewhere deep inside. He didn't want to. A squirrel darted across the steps. Vincent watched it without a change in expression. Then he turned back inside and closed the door. In his inbox, a new notification appeared. A temporary housekeeper has been assigned. She will arrive Monday morning. Vincent didn't bother reading the name. He didn't need to. He just muttered quietly to himself. Just a few weeks. Then everything will be quiet again. What he didn't know was that quiet would never return, because the woman about to walk through that door, without even trying, would make him remember what it felt like to smile. Callie Morgan arrived right on Monday morning, just as scheduled. Vincent didn't open the door. He only glanced at the doorbell camera and pressed the automatic unlock button from the kitchen. On the screen appeared a young woman, slender, wearing a faded green coat and a gray knit beanie, standing beside an old bicycle with a front basket holding a few books and a tin box. Her shoes were flat canvas ones, frayed at the heels, probably a few years old. She looked nothing like any housekeeper Vincent had ever hired, who usually wore crisp uniforms, name tags, and arrived by taxi or service car. This one looked as if she'd just stepped out of a small-town bookstore, carrying with her the faint scent of cookies and the quiet music in her eyes. She knocked twice, then smiled straight at the camera. "Good morning. I'm Callie Morgan. Right on time, aren't I?" Vincent didn't respond, but the door clicked open. Callie stepped inside, pulling a worn fabric suitcase and holding the tin box of cookies in her hand. "Beautiful house," she said as she took off her scarf. "Quiet, just the way I like it. I even saw 3 deer crossing the road about a mile back this morning. Looked like something straight out of a postcard." Vincent still said nothing. He stood on the staircase above, giving a brief nod. His eyes swept over her, assessing, but Callie didn't seem the least bit uneasy or awkward. She just smiled up at him like she was greeting a friendly neighbor. "You're Vincent Hale, right?" she asked, her tone light and natural. "Thanks for giving me a chance to work here. I'll only be around for 3 weeks, so I'll do my best to make everything as comfortable as possible." Vincent simply nodded, then turned and walked away. Callie didn't seem the least bit flustered. She set her suitcase down, hung her coat by the door, and began walking around the house to get familiar with the space. Each time she passed a window, she drew the curtains open, letting sunlight spill in. She didn't ask for permission. But she wasn't rude either. She moved as if light were something naturally meant to be there, something this house had simply forgotten for too long. By late morning, while Vincent was working in his private study, he heard soft music drifting up from the kitchen. Not loud, but smooth. Classic jazz. Louis Armstrong, if he guessed right. He started to go downstairs to turn it off, but then he didn't. Callie was wiping down the kitchen cabinets, quietly humming along to the lyrics. Beside her sat the open tin box. Inside were layers of almond butter cookies, neatly stacked between sheets of parchment paper. On the lid, written in ink, were the words, "Homemade. Always better." She didn't put the cookies out to offer. Just left them there, a quiet trace that she'd been in this place, with her hands and her heart. That afternoon, while cleaning an old study on the second floor, a room untouched and dust-covered for nearly a year, Callie used a dry cloth to wipe the bookshelves. Her fingers paused when they brushed against a picture frame lying face down on the wooden shelf. No note, no attempt to hide it. Just a frame deliberately turned over. Callie didn't pick it up right away. She hesitated for a moment, then gently turned it over. Inside was an old, faded photograph, a young woman holding a little girl, maybe 6 years old. Both were smiling brightly, their eyes turned toward the camera. The joy in that photo was so vivid, Callie couldn't look away. But she didn't ask. She didn't sigh. She simply placed the frame back exactly as it had been, face down, and went on cleaning as if she had never seen it at all. By the end of the day, when Vincent left his study, he found himself wandering toward the backyard, the old play corner that once belonged to his daughter. The late afternoon sunlight was soft like velvet, and in that quiet, he heard the sound of a harmonica drifting from somewhere behind the lavender bushes. The notes were simple, unpolished, yet gentle and sad, like autumn smoke curling from a chimney. He walked closer, careful not to make a sound. Through the leaves, he saw Callie sitting on an old wooden chair, playing the harmonica alone. Her hair was tousled by the breeze, and her eyes weren't looking down, but far off, toward the pine forest at the edge of the horizon. Her face still held the same brightness as that morning, but in her eyes now there was a quiet sorrow, achingly beautiful. Not loud, not broken. Just a kind of silence that felt ancient, as if she too had lost something long ago, something no one remembered to ask about anymore. Vincent wasn't sure when it started, but the mornings in the house began to carry the smell of hand-roasted coffee and the sound of footsteps light as a breeze. Callie didn't talk much, didn't make noise, and never asked questions that weren't welcome. Yet somehow, her presence made the silence in the house feel different, no longer cold. Everything was still quiet, but no longer empty. She tidied the kitchen in her own way, rearranging the spices so they looked neater, replacing the tablecloth with a beige one, dotted with tiny flowers. She placed an old glass jar in the center of the dining table and swapped out the dried flowers every 3 days. She didn't ask for permission, but she didn't need to. She did it as if she were caring for a space she herself had to live in, at least for those 3 weeks. Vincent didn't complain. At first, he thought he'd find it bothersome, but strangely, he didn't. When Callie made coffee differently than he usually did, adding a bit of orange peel and a pinch of cocoa powder, he tried it out of curiosity and found it wasn't bad. When she opened the curtains each morning and sunlight streamed through the windows, revealing every speck of dust in the air, Vincent didn't get irritated. He just grabbed a cloth and wiped the shelves. She often brought along small pastries and a book she was in the middle of reading. Sometimes she left the book open, face down on the kitchen table, beside a half-finished cup of chamomile tea. She wasn't the kind of person who drew attention, but her presence felt like a soft background melody that you only noticed when it was gone. One afternoon, while Vincent was checking his emails on the porch, Callie came out with 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed him one, then sat on the steps beside him, leaving just enough space to be polite. They sat like that for nearly 5 minutes without saying a word. Then Callie asked a simple question, one that sounded more like she was asking herself. "Do you ever dream?" Vincent set his glass down and turned to look at her. It wasn't an angry look, nor confused, just surprised. She kept her gaze on the lawn, not turning toward him. "I used to dream every night," he said quietly, his voice low and even. "But not anymore. Or maybe I do. I just don't remember." Callie nodded slightly, not pressing further. After a moment, she spoke, her tone calm but clear, without a trace of self-pity. "I once lived in a shelter for 3 months. It was winter then. I didn't know where I'd go next, or if it was even worth trying to." Vincent watched her, but she didn't turn toward him. Her voice carried no tears. It was simply a fragment of a life, folded carefully and opened again because someone was quietly listening. He didn't ask why, didn't ask who had hurt her, but he listened, really listened, and remembered. Not out of curiosity, but because, for the first time in 10 years, he found himself wanting to understand someone. A few nights later, late in the evening, Vincent stepped into the backyard to check the glass doors and noticed one hadn't been locked. The wind slipped through the gap, cold and damp. He was about to close it when he saw Callie sitting on her old bicycle under the maple tree at the edge of the yard. She didn't know anyone was watching. Her eyes were fixed on the dark line of trees, her shoulders drawn in as if bracing against the wind, but not from the cold. She sat motionless, hands gripping the handlebars like they were the last thing keeping her steady. Her head was bowed, hair falling over half her face, and in the silence of the night, Vincent saw her shoulders tremble ever so slightly. She didn't sob, didn't make a sound, but her tears still fell quietly, slowly, as if they'd done so many times before, and this was just another continuation. Vincent stood a few meters away, the back door key still in his hand. He didn't call out, didn't step closer. He just watched for a moment, then turned back inside, closing the door softly behind him. That night, Vincent lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the ticking of the clock, the wind slipping through the cracks, and an echo coming from somewhere, not from outside, but from within his own chest. A strange stirring, faint, undefined, yet strong enough to keep him from falling asleep again. He thought about her question. "Do you ever dream?" And for the first time in years, Vincent felt his heartbeat so clearly. Not because the dreams had returned, but because, in the darkness of a house long accustomed to silence, he realized something undeniable. Callie carried her own scars, just like he did. And maybe neither of them was the only one still awake tonight. The next morning, Vincent woke earlier than usual. The sky outside was still gray, no sunlight yet filtering through the trees. In the kitchen, he turned on the coffee machine as always, but when he passed his study, his feet stopped on their own. On the familiar wooden shelf, the picture frame still lay face down. Just as it had for the past 10 years. He stood there for a long moment, expression unchanged. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand and turned the frame upright. No sound, no clear thought in his mind, just emotion that felt like it had been waiting for years to happen. A few minutes later, Callie walked past the doorway, a laundry basket in her hands. She caught a glimpse of the photo now standing upright. She didn't stop, didn't say a word. But when she brought coffee to his study later, beside the steaming cup was a small oatmeal cookie, faintly scented with cinnamon, the kind a mother might bake for her daughter before school. Vincent sat at his desk, laptop open but untouched. His eyes rested on the picture frame. There was no sharp pain anymore, only something faintly warm, softly aching, like when a wound long forgotten is brushed by a cool breeze. The day passed quietly. But within that quiet, small things began to change. Brief exchanges began to happen. Not long conversations, not deep questions or stories, just quiet snippets in the kitchen, sometimes while changing a trash bag, or when Callie sat folding towels in the laundry room. "Did you used to live in the city?" "Yeah, but I can't stand the sound of car horns anymore." "Me neither. I once lived near a hospital, heard ambulances every night." Vincent wasn't used to talking without a clear purpose. But with Callie, those small bits of conversation didn't tire him. On the contrary, they felt like drops of water soaking into dry, cracked earth. Callie began doing things that weren't on her task list. She hung a few bundles of dried lavender in the kitchen, letting the scent drift gently through the air. She rearranged the bookshelf in the reading room, not by author, but by the color of the covers, creating a soft gradient from white to blue. She laid a hand-woven cloth over the tea table, and instead of a scented candle, she placed a small bowl of pebbles, ones she'd picked from the stream behind the house that morning. Vincent didn't complain. He didn't praise her either. But he left everything as it was, untouched, unmoved. That evening, after Callie finished cleaning up and was about to retreat to her room, she hesitated for a moment before pouring herself a cup of tea. "If you could talk to someone who's gone," she asked softly, "what's the first thing you'd say?" Vincent was standing by the window, hands in his pockets, his back tilted slightly toward the porch light outside. He didn't turn around. The question lingered in the air long enough to seem like it might go unanswered. Then he spoke, his voice so quiet that Callie almost had to hold her breath to hear it. "Sorry for disappearing after you did." Callie didn't reply. She just poured the tea, set the cup on the kitchen counter, and walked toward the door. But when she reached it, she looked back. Vincent was still there. His shadow stretched long across the wall, the picture frame now standing upright on the shelf, silent and facing the right way. That night, Vincent didn't go upstairs to his room right away. Instead, he walked to the end of the second-floor hallway, to a door that had been closed for 10 years. His hand touched the doorknob like it was a handful of warm ashes. The room opened into the scent of time itself. Damp air, aged wood, and the faint trace of children's shampoo long since gone. It was a small, lovely room with cloud-patterned wallpaper, a tiny white dresser, and a single bed still made exactly as it had been the last time someone lay there. No one had ever cleaned it. Everything remained the same: the old toys, the tangled-haired doll, the picture book left open on the shelf, as if a little girl had only stepped out that morning. Vincent walked in, his steps as soft as a stranger entering a sacred place. He went to the bed, sat down, and placed his hand on the small pillow. And right there, without a sound, without warning, his body began to tremble. Tears fell onto the pillow, onto his hands, onto the faded bedsheet. For the first time in 10 years, Vincent cried. Not the kind of cry that tore through the air, but the quiet kind. The kind of cry that comes from someone who has held pain for so long that when it finally spills out, even he doesn't know exactly what broke inside him. Everything around him blurred, and each breath, each trembling sob, carried years of silence finally dissolving into something real. The next morning, after the night Vincent reopened that old room, everything in the house went on as usual. No one mentioned anything. Callie still woke early, opened the curtains, brewed coffee, and placed a small plate of cookies beside Vincent's cup. He still came down at exactly 7 a.m., gave a faint nod in place of a greeting, and sat at the table, just like every other morning. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the distance between two strangers, but a quiet kind of understanding that needed no words, a knowing born not from sharing, but from witnessing. From that day on, their eyes met a little longer. And sometimes, Vincent caught himself watching Callie as she crossed the backyard, carrying the trash bin, humming tunelessly under her breath. He began to notice things he'd never noticed before. The days when Callie ate less than usual, the times she answered simple questions with just a nod before gently changing the subject. One afternoon, when he saw her sitting on the porch during her lunch break, Vincent brought out 2 cups of tea. Callie looked up, a bit surprised, then smiled and accepted hers. They sat there for a while, and Vincent spoke, his voice low and careful, as if afraid to disturb the fragile quiet between them. "You've never mentioned your family." Callie didn't answer right away. She took a small sip of tea, set the cup down on the step, and clasped her hands together. "I used to have an older sister," she said softly. 6 years older. She was the only one who ever stood between me and my stepfather. I'll never forget that feeling, having someone who'd place themselves between you and your fear." Vincent stayed silent. Callie went on, her voice steady now, but rough around the edges, like wind brushing past an old window frame. "She died in an accident, on her way home after picking up divorce papers for my mom. I still remember the shirt she wore that day, pale yellow with little wooden buttons on the cuffs. She was the only person in the world who ever taught me that I didn't have to apologize just for existing." Vincent nodded slowly. He didn't ask anything more. But from that day on, whenever Callie stayed out in the garden for too long, he would open the kitchen window, just enough so that if anything happened, he could hear. One weekend morning, while Callie was still asleep, Vincent went out to the backyard. Her old bicycle was there, its paint chipped, the chains squeaking with every pedal. He wheeled it into the shed and dug out the tools he hadn't touched in years. It took him over 2 hours, replacing the chain, oiling the gears, adjusting the handlebars and tires. By the time the sun was fully up, the bike was back in its place, clean, quiet, and steady. Callie found it later when she went to get the mail. She looked at the bike, then around the yard, but saw no one. A small note was clipped to the handlebar. Pedaling will be easier now, but you still have to keep your balance. She folded the note, slipped it into her pocket, and said nothing, but the smile on her face stayed all day. One late afternoon, while they were cleaning out the old shed together, they came across a small wooden box wrapped in worn silver paper. Vincent didn't recognize it at first, but when Callie gently wiped off the dust and lifted the lid, a melody began to play. An old music box, ivory-colored, its lullaby chiming softly in delicate tones. No words, just sound, but enough to wake every memory at once. Vincent froze. It was the music box his wife had bought for their daughter's 5th birthday. The little girl used to fall asleep clutching it every night, refusing to let it go. He thought he'd forgotten that sound. But now, as it filled the air of a house that had been quiet for far too long, Vincent found he couldn't move. Callie didn't ask, didn't speak. She simply placed her hand over his, warm, gentle, not holding, not urging, just steady enough to keep him standing when his legs trembled from the weight of emotion. They didn't speak while finishing up the shed, but when they came back inside, Callie quietly turned on some evening jazz, letting the music drift through the house. Vincent didn't say thank you, but as he walked past the living room, he brushed his hand lightly against her shoulder, a brief, almost imperceptible touch that said more than words ever could. After that, dinners began to sound different. There were small laughs, not loud, not forced, just short, genuine bursts that came naturally. Callie would tell little stories, like how the neighbor's cat once chased her when she took out the trash, or how she pretended to be French to get a discount at a used bookstore. Vincent, in turn, started sharing old stories from his company days. No names, no technical talk, just bits like the argument over a logo redesign, or the time he got stuck in an elevator with a delivery robot. They looked at each other longer during dinner now, no more avoiding each other's eyes. And as the wine glasses emptied and the kitchen lights glowed soft and golden, something quiet and warm lingered between them, something that didn't need to be named. Both of them knew it was there. And it was real. It didn't need definition or confession. It only needed to keep existing, the way Callie had first entered this house, gently, patiently, and true enough to stay. What they shared didn't have a name, no label, no promises. But it was there. In the glances that lingered a little too long, in silences that no longer felt awkward, in the small, quiet gestures no one else would notice, but both of them would remember. So when Callie told him she'd received a job offer at an art therapy center in another city, a full-time position, good benefits, a place to stay, and no more moving around, Vincent only nodded. Congratulations. Callie smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She nodded back, saying nothing more. They both knew what it meant, but neither asked. Are you sure? Do you want to stay? Do you want me to ask you to? Because those questions, if spoken, would become bindings, and Vincent had never been the kind of man to hold someone close with feelings he hadn't yet learned how to name. He knew too well what loss felt like, and he didn't want anyone to feel trapped by kindness or by hesitation. After that conversation, Callie began packing bit by bit. Her work schedule grew lighter, not out of distance, but as if she were quietly teaching them both how to get used to the emptiness that was coming. Vincent didn't stop her, but every time he didn't see her pass by the kitchen at the usual hour, he felt a small, nameless hollow open inside him. Callie no longer played music in the evenings. Dinners stopped happening together. She began leaving his meal on the stove with small notes, warmed up already, or don't forget to eat. The notes grew shorter and quieter. On Saturday morning, Callie left. Vincent walked her only as far as the gate. She carried her old suitcase, a gray canvas backpack, and the familiar tin of cookies. She wasn't riding her bike anymore. It had been shipped off a few days earlier, along with the rest of her belongings. The bus arrived on time. Before stepping aboard, Callie turned to look at Vincent. Her eyes didn't say goodbye, didn't hold resentment. Just a slow, steady gaze, as if she wanted to memorize every detail of his face, the curve of the porch, the stones lining the path. Thank you for everything. Vincent didn't answer, but his hand tightened inside his coat pocket, as if letting go might mean losing something that had only just begun to grow. The bus rolled away, kicking up a thin trail of dust along the red dirt road that led to the main highway. Vincent stood there, watching until it disappeared around the bend. And even when there was nothing left to see, he didn't go back inside. Neither of them said it aloud, but both knew they'd lost something that wouldn't be easy to find again. Back in the house, everything was exactly the same. The spotless floors, the tidy kitchen, the windows open just so, letting in the softest slice of light. But there was no music playing from the small speaker on the counter. No cookies beside his coffee cup. No trace of cinnamon in the morning air. No sound of Callie mumbling to the neighbor's cat when she took out the trash. Even her quiet laughter, the one that had always been so soft, now echoed too loudly in his memory. Vincent walked through the house, room by room. Every corner, every detail still carried traces of Callie, but she was no longer there. He climbed the stairs and made his way to the reading room. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. On the bookshelf, where once everything had been arranged alphabetically, now stretched a soft gradient of colors from pale to deep. And at the center of that shelf sat the old photograph, the one of his wife and daughter. But it wasn't the same frame that had once been turned face down. It was new, warm oak, rounded edges, standing upright in its place. Beside it lay a small folded note, written in Callie's familiar hand. "She would be proud of you. So am I." Vincent read it, but didn't fold it back. He set it gently beside the frame, as if it were a continuation of what the photo hadn't finished saying. His heart tightened in a strange way. Not from pain, but from something else. The kind of ache that reminds you you're still alive, that you can still feel, that somewhere out there, someone once saw you more clearly than you ever saw yourself, and accepted you, even without a single promise. 2 months passed after Callie left. The house no longer echoed with light footsteps in the morning, and the dried flowers weren't replaced every 3 days anymore. But Vincent was no longer living in isolation. The silence that once felt like a void had become a kind of breathing space. One early spring morning, Vincent stood by the window in his study, looking out at the trees beginning to bud. He rested his hand on the mouse, opened his laptop, and for the first time in 10 years, he logged into the internal system of his old company, the one he had founded, then walked away from. His account was still active. No one had dared touch it. They'd kept his access intact as a sign of respect, or maybe in quiet anticipation. Vincent sent a short email to the executive board. "I want to come back, starting with a small project, nonprofit, for children who've lost their families. If anyone still believes in me, join me." Less than an hour later, the first reply came in. Then the second. And soon, an online meeting was scheduled for that very afternoon. Vincent couldn't tell if his hands were trembling from nerves or from the unfamiliar rush of touching something alive again. He didn't try to become who he once was. He simply began with what he understood best: loss, and what it means to survive it. The first project was a platform that connected volunteers who had lost loved ones with orphaned children living in foster systems. Not to replace parents, not to promise everlasting love, just to be a hand reaching out, at the moment it was needed most. Vincent no longer worked like a man hiding from his emotions. He walked into the office like someone who had survived a storm, carrying a heart still marked by scars, but beating again nonetheless. He still lived alone, in the same old house, but every morning he walked the trail behind the woods, carrying a water bottle and his headphones. Some days he stopped by the used bookstore in the nearby town, where the owner knew his name and always recommended novels with protagonists who were imperfect. He began calling a few old friends again, not to apologize, but simply to ask, "How have you been?" A small question, but one he hadn't asked anyone in 10 years. Vincent smiled more often now. He couldn't tell when it started. Maybe it was the day he opened the door for a kid selling cookies for a school fundraiser. Maybe it was when he heard an old jazz tune, one Callie used to play. Or maybe it was for no reason at all, just a moment when sunlight hit the kitchen counter just right, and everything felt a little lighter. One afternoon, while checking the mailbox, Vincent found a package. No specific sender listed, just a return address from a city he knew Callie had moved to. He opened it. Inside was a small, old-fashioned voice recorder, the kind that ran on AA batteries, and a short handwritten note. "My voice isn't great, but you once said you'd forgotten how to dream. So here's something to start with again. Don't laugh. Or do. He pressed play. Kali's voice filled the room, a little offbeat but warm and real. She was singing a simple children's song, maybe one his daughter used to love. There were a few wrong lyrics, a few spots where she laughed mid-verse, like she was singing alone in the kitchen and had just spilled flour on the floor. Vincent sat quietly, listening. No one else was in the room, no one around him at all. And yet, he didn't feel alone. He started laughing, not because something was funny, but because warmth had reached a place inside him he hadn't felt in years. He stood up and walked toward the hallway mirror. Almost unconsciously, he stared at his reflection for a long time. His face had changed, more lines, heavier eyes, but his mouth was smiling. And this time that face was no longer a stranger to its own smile. It was a part of him again, called back not by a miracle, but by someone who had seen him, even when he hadn't dared to see himself. There are wounds that don't need to be erased, only touched gently enough that they no longer make us flinch. Vincent didn't forget the ones he'd lost. But through Kali's quiet, genuine presence, he remembered that he was still alive. No one comes to save anyone. Sometimes it's simply that one person stays, patiently enough, for another to find their way back to themselves. Because sometimes, the most healing thing isn't a promise, but a look that says, you're still worthy of being loved.